This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We start with an NBC News investigation and exclusive details of Russian cyber intrusion in the 2016 election that went deeper and wider than the public has been told. We've learned details of a covert Russian operation that officials say infiltrated election systems in 7 states. This as the nation's top cyber intelligence chief testified today the United States has not done enough to combat Russian interference in upcoming elections.
I believe that President Putin has clearly come to the conclusion there's little price to play here.
With the critical midterm elections just months away, is the government doing enough to protect your vote? NBC News senior investigative correspondent Cynthia McFadden has our report.
Tonight, NBC News has learned that top-secret intelligence requested by President Obama in his last weeks in office identified 7 states where there was substantial evidence of compromise by the Russians prior to the 2016 election, all part of a broad-based covert operation. 3 senior intelligence officials tell NBC News, as of January 2017, the states were believed to be Alaska, California, Arizona, Texas, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Florida. The intelligence was a synthesis of months of work as the intelligence community continued to evaluate. However, multiple federal officials tell NBC News that the states were never told of the intelligence assessment that they had been successfully compromised by the Russian government. Washington did tell several states that a foreign government was probing their election systems.
I think the Obama administration should have been doing much more to push back against the Russians across the board.
Juan Zarate was Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism under President George W. Bush.
The U.S. was very meek and mild in how we responded to Russian aggression.
Dennis McDonough, President Obama's chief of staff, strongly disagrees, arguing the administration took many actions to thwart the Russians before and after the election, including briefing top congressional leaders about the highly classified intelligence.
The administration took a series of steps to push back against the Russians, to include far-ranging sanctions, diplomatic steps to push people associated with the Russian effort out of this country, and also warning our friends and allies.
Officials tell NBC News the states were compromised in a variety of ways. Some breaches more serious than others, from entry into state websites by the Russians to penetration of actual voter registration databases. While Illinois itself detected a malicious cyber attack on its voter registration system, exposing the personal information of 86,000 voters, the other 6 states vigorously deny their election systems were ever compromised based on their own cyber investigations. All the states and federal officials we spoke to do agree no votes were changed and no voters were taken off the rolls. But 16 months after the election and 8 months until the critical midterms, many state and federal officials are convinced the Russians will be back. The 2016 was a rehearsal, preparing the battle space for a future attack.
We have an extreme sense of urgency on ensuring the security of the 2018 elections because you don't get a chance to do it over.
While numerous state election officials told NBC News the Department of Homeland Security has been stepping up their communications with them, many say they worry they're not getting enough information from Washington.
It is hugely imperative that intelligence be shared with state elections officials immediately in order to protect our election infrastructure and the integrity of election results.
Reluctance to share the information with the states may have been due in part to the classification of the intelligence itself. Multiple intelligence officials tell NBC News pinning it on the Russian government came from exceptionally sensitive sources and methods, including human spies and eavesdropping on Russian communications. No state election official at the time had a security clearance sufficient to permit access to such sensitive information.
Whether or not state elections officials have the proper clearance has unfortunately been an excuse, in my opinion, for why information or intelligence hasn't been more quickly shared with state elections officials. We've got to fix that right away.
I think too much of this has happened behind the veil of the government, and much more has to be discussed openly with the public.
Bradley Moss, a lawyer specialized in national security, tried to lift that veil. He wanted to find out what U.S. intelligence knew about the Russian attempts to compromise the voter system. He sued and won, and just last week received 118 top-secret pages, almost completely blacked out.
The spreadsheets show that there were documented breaches of election networks, and that there was a widespread concern among several agencies in the intelligence community about the sanctity and the integrity of these election networks.
As for the future, Juan Zarate suggests a lesson from the past.
After 9/11, the walls between law enforcement and intelligence services had to be broken down in order to connect the dots. There has to be a whole of government and a whole of nation approach to dealing with what is an assault on American democracy.
While the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security say they are taking steps to shore up cyber defenses, the director of the National Security Agency, Admiral Mike Rogers, was asked today whether the U.S. was doing enough to stop the Russians.
We're taking steps, but we're probably not doing enough.
Why the hell not?
Ma'am,
What's it going to take?
I'm an operational commander, ma'am. You're asking me a question that's so much bigger than me.
So where is the president on all of this? FBI Director Christopher Wray was asked earlier this month.
Has the president directed you and your agency to take specific actions to confront and blunt Russian influence activities that are ongoing?
We're taking a lot of specific efforts to blunt
Are they
Russian
directed by the president?
not as specifically directed by the president.
The White House today pushed back on any suggestion they're not doing enough, saying President Trump is, quote, looking at a number of different ways of making sure that Russia doesn't meddle in our elections. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security tells us they work to declassify information rapidly and grant one-day security clearances to state officials when necessary.
The ominous takeaway, this might have been a rehearsal, and they might be back.
Correct.